Good morning. What a joy to be with you this morning and worship with you today. Welcome to those who are with us online today as well. We're glad that you're here. Would you like to know what our children in this congregation are thankful for? You really need to come on Tuesday night or plan to be with us, because I have a stack here of about 18 different responses from our children of what they are thankful for this year, and they go the whole range from the snakes and the lizards and the trees to the parents who bring them to church, to the God who keeps them safe. I have a stack about this size from our youth group as well that I'm looking forward to sharing with you on Tuesday. And if you have not yet had a chance to share as well with our congregation what you are thankful for, find one of these sheets. They're in the lobbies. Respond to the email. You'll be getting a reminder tomorrow. And let's give thanks together on Tuesday. I'm really excited about that. I'm also excited about our lesson for today. Today we have our third lesson from the Gospel of Luke, the third in this series of stories about Jesus at the dinner table, although I think you will be hard-pressed to find an actual dinner table in this story, and that is hardly the strangest thing about it. I'm talking about Luke chapter 9. If you'd like to get out a Bible and turn there, that's where we're going to be today, Luke chapter 9. Tim began our reading of this story just a moment ago. Now, Jesus says and does some strange things from time to time. You know that. But of all of the strange things he says and does, the thing he says in this passage has to be right up there near the top. In this passage, we have 6 of the weirdest words that Jesus says in his ministry. Would you like to hear them? You give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. This is what Jesus says to the apostles when they come to him in Acts chapter 9. So the apostles come to him and they say, send the crowds away to go find lodging and get provisions, because we are here in this desolate place. Send these crowds away, Jesus. And when they say send these crowds away, they're talking about a crowd of 5,000 plus people. Verse 14 that we're going to get to in a minute tells us that there were 5,000 men there on this day, not including women and children if they were there. So if they were there, how many people are we talking about here? 6,000? 7,000? 10,000 people? This is who the disciples are talking about when they say, send the crowds away. And Jesus says to that, you give them something to eat. What in the world? Is he being sarcastic? He can't possibly be serious about this, right? I mean, it would be one thing if this were a planned event, something that they had in mind before. Like last week in our bulletins, we had an event, a luncheon, and you may remember reading there, lunch will be provided. Isn't that a great set of words right there? Lunch will be provided. And boy, was it. If you were able to stay, we had pasta and we had breadsticks and there was cake in a jar. There was a plan and it was delivered to perfection. Imagine, though, if the scenario was that we'd been talking for weeks about this luncheon and lunch will be provided. We get there on the morning of and the people who are providing lunch say, yeah, we don't have any food. We better just send them home. In that situation, Jesus' statement would make a lot of sense. You promised them food. You got to give them something. Give them something to eat. But that's not really the situation here, is it? Take a closer look at verses 10 and 11. The story starts like this. On their return, the apostles told Jesus all that they had done. And when it says that, on their return, it's talking about this preaching tour that the apostles have just finished up. You actually read about it at the start of this chapter in verse 1, if you want to look just a few verses above it. And Jesus called the 12 together, and he gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, "Take nothing for your journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money. And do not have 2 tunics. And whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave the town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them." And so they departed, and they went through the villages, preaching and healing everywhere. So that is what the apostles have been doing. When this verse at the start of our story, verse 10, says, "On their return, they told them everything," it means that the apostles have just gotten back from, call it a short-term mission trip if you want. And they're probably feeling what we feel when you get back from a short-term mission trip. You're worn out and you're fired up all at the same time. And they come back and they're telling Jesus their stories from this mission adventure that they've just had in the villages and in the towns. And I think the last thing that would be on their minds in this moment is hosting the largest gathering that we know about in any of the Gospels. A gathering for 5,000 to 10,000 people. What's on their minds is exactly the opposite. We read about it in the rest of verse 10. When they got back from this trip, from their mission trip, Jesus took them and they withdrew away to a town called Bethsaida. So here they are, they're retreating. They are recharging. They're going away from the crowds onto this little retreat after their mission adventure. But when the crowds learn about this, like wedding crashers, they just crash right on in on this retreat of the apostles and Jesus, and they're coming from everywhere. The crowds learned of it, and they followed him to that place. So Jesus does what Jesus does, and he welcomed them, and he spoke to them of the kingdom of God, and he cured all of those who were in need of healing. But now it's getting late. And the day has been wearing on, and this is when the disciples say, "Lord, you better just send them home. Send the 5,000 to 10,000 people that are crushing in on us, send them away, because we weren't even planning on this at all. And we never said in the bulletin that lunch would be provided. These people came in unannounced. They crashed our retreat, and now they're all here. And you healed them, and you taught them, and you spoke to them about the kingdom of God all day long, and that was amazing, but it's getting late. And they've got to be starving. And the closest Chick-fil-A is way back in town, and it closes in 20 minutes. Let them go, Jesus. Time is running short. We weren't even planning on hosting them, much less feeding them. And Jesus says to all that, you give them something to eat. Now, have I sufficiently established how crazy this must sound to the disciples? How unreasonable and unexpected for him to say that to them. Put yourself in their shoes. Like, wouldn't you just be like at a total loss of what to do with that? What are you going to do? And the disciples are. They say to Jesus, we have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. Unless we're to go and buy food for all these people. What do you mean you give them something to eat? So, what does Jesus mean? It sounds crazy. We know that Jesus is anything but that. Jesus is the most thoughtful, intentional person there ever was. So why is he saying this to them? Could it be that there's a lesson he's trying to teach them from this? Could it be a lesson that we might need to learn as well? I think the answer is yes, and here's why. Do you remember what the disciples were doing before this big crowd came and crashed their retreat? We saw this. Do you remember what they were doing? They were out preaching. Christ had sent the 12 on into the villages and the towns, and he gave them power and authority to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal those who were in need. And there was only one catch. Jesus gave them a packing list. Do you remember what was on it? Not much. This is the opposite of the way my parents pack for vacation here. He said to them, take nothing for your journey. Not a staff, not a bag, no bread, no money. One tunic, no change of clothes, no hotel reservation. Just stay with whoever welcomes you into their house. Pack your bags like you're flying Spirit Airlines, and they're going to charge you $50 for a carry-on. Pack light. That's what Jesus tells them. Why would Jesus give them these instructions? What is he trying to teach them? I don't think it's a trick question. I think Jesus is trying to teach them to depend on God. And maybe even more than that, he's teaching them the sufficiency of God to accomplish his will in them. And at the end of the mission, when they look back on this trip and all the things that they've done and seen, they're going to be able to say, look, it wasn't our resources and our perfectly executed plans and all of our possessions and skills that made this happen. What we lacked in money and what we lacked in bread, God more than made up for by his power. And it was sufficient. He was sufficient. So this is the trip that Christ has just designed for them. And when they come back from the trip, they are telling Jesus about all that they had done, which might be a perfectly harmless phrase, or they may be talking about all the things that we, the apostles, accomplished, what we did. They're telling stories about their mission trip. So Jesus says, okay, let's see if you learned the lesson of the mission trip. On this trip, you lacked money and you lacked bread, and you had to look to God to provide sufficiently for what you lacked. Now you've got no bread again. So, where are you going to look? Where are you going to turn? So where do the disciples look? Jesus, you really don't expect us to go and buy them all this food, do you? This is where the disciples' minds go. I say that with no judgment in my heart because I feel like I would probably say the very same thing. Do you see how their solution to the bread problem was a money solution? And it's really no solution at all because it just brings them back to the same place where they're thinking about all that they don't have and all that they can't do. Their insufficiency to meet this need. When all the while, I believe Christ is teaching them a different way of thinking, a different way of seeing. Jesus is training them to share in the work of the kingdom. That's what he was doing when he sent them off to go preach. That's what he's reinforcing now. And he wants them to learn that the success of the kingdom of God rests not upon what they can do or not do, what they have or don't have, what they possess or do not possess. Those things matter, but they're not the true source. No, the success of the kingdom of God depends on the power and sufficiency of God. That's where the real power lies. That's what truly makes the difference in the end. It's not really that much different than the lesson Paul learns as he tries to minister in Corinth. In his second letter to them, about 25 years after this or so, he writes that we've come to realize that in this ministry, we are not sufficient in ourselves to claim that anything has come from us. But our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. Jesus is teaching them that same kind of lesson here. First, he taught it with their mission trip. Now he's teaching it through the bread and the crowds. Have they learned yet that what they lack in bread and money, God can make up for by his power? Where are they going to turn for their insufficiencies? And that's a pretty big question for us too. Where will we turn? Will we turn to God and find that he is able to do what we cannot do? To be who we cannot be? That Jesus is sufficient? That God is able? Where will we turn? See, to me, that is just like the brilliant thing behind this seemingly crazy statement of Jesus. You give them something to eat. It's so obviously impossible that the disciples have two options. They can either turn to the one who can make it possible or throw up their hands and quit. And just when they're about to throw up their hands and quit, Jesus says, well, let's actually do this instead. Make them sit down in 50s. That's a lot of 50s. So they do that. And then taking what little they had to give, that totally insufficient amount of bread, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, Jesus looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples, note that, to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. They were satisfied. And at the end of it all, what was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. Now, there's something about this story that amazes me, besides just the miracle that, of course, amazes me. Does it surprise you just a little bit that all Luke has to say about the crowd and the way they respond to this miracle, this unbelievable miracle, is everybody ate, we're satisfied. And that's it? Like, that's all that he says? Like, no amazement, no wonder, no mention of any of that at all? What's up with that? And you might say, well, maybe they just don't know that Jesus fed them with only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe they're just like unaware of it all. Except they've just crashed this retreat unannounced. There's 5,000 to 10,000 people here. It wasn't in the bulletin. Lunch will be provided. They just showed up. Now, who do you know that can feed 5,000 to 10,000 people with anything that they have available just on the drop of a hat? So they got to know something's going on here. And when John tells this story, they very much know what's going on here, and they go nuts. In John 6, their first reaction to the miracle of feeding the 5,000 is, let's make this guy king right now. And when Jesus crosses the lake, they follow him. They get in their boats and they follow. And they're telling him, like, do it again. Another miracle like this. Give us this bread always. But Luke doesn't give us any of those reactions. I think Luke is so focused on the lesson for the disciples, the workers in the kingdom, that he hardly says anything about the reaction of the crowds except one thing: they were satisfied. What God did was sufficient. God took care of what they needed. Meanwhile, Luke is hammering this point home about the workers in the kingdom. This is a story for the disciples. And if we are disciples, then this is a story for us. So Luke focuses his attention on the role that the disciples play. Remember how Jesus took the bread and he blessed it and he broke it and he gave it to the disciples to set before all the people? See, Jesus is giving the disciples a part to play in what he's doing. Now, you give them something to eat, they couldn't do that. They were insufficient for that. But sharing what Jesus could do, sharing what Jesus had done, that was very much their role. That was very much their part to play. Jesus gives a role to the disciples. And just like that, Jesus gives this role to us as well. It's tempting to place ourselves on the pedestal of trying to be the ones who are sufficient, to make God's plans successful by our expertise and our possessions and our plans and our skills. That's not our part to play. Our role is to share what God has done by his power, to satisfy the world's deep hunger, to meet the world's greatest needs. The disciples' role is our role too. Luke is also quick to point out a reminder that Jesus gives to the disciples. So you remember how at the end of the story there's leftovers. I am always personally excited when there's leftovers at the end of a meal. In this case, there are a lot of leftovers. 12 baskets of broken pieces. And you think that's important? I do. One basket for each one of those 12 that Jesus is trying to teach this lesson to. Jesus not only teaches them the lesson, but he gives them this tangible, lasting, put it in your hands and remember it, that God is sufficient, that God was able to do what they could not do. These broken pieces of bread are that reminder. And didn't Christ leave us that reminder too? A lesson in the broken bread. Every week when we gather together, we take communion, the Lord's Supper. We break the bread together. It's something that Christ himself does in the Gospel of Luke. Luke describes how he took the loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, when he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. He said, "This is my body. Do this in remembrance of me." And I wonder when Jesus took and he blessed and he broke and he gave that bread at that Last Supper, are his disciples thinking about when he took and he blessed and he broke and he gave that bread to the crowds in Bethsaida? If they are, they're remembering that God can do what they can't do and that God is sufficient. And when we break the bread, that's what Christ is reminding us of too. Christ being able to do what we could not. Solving the problem that we could not solve. The problem of our sin. And his grace is more than sufficient for us. So the disciples' reminder is our reminder as well. And lastly, Luke doesn't just focus on the crowds and how amazed they are. He spends much more time talking about those very same disciples and how they respond. You see this in the next story, very next verses. It happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and Jesus, one more time, checks in to see if they're getting the lesson that he's been teaching them all throughout this chapter. He says, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they answered, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others say one of the prophets of old who has risen. Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ of God." The Christ of God. Spoken like someone who's beginning to get the lesson. Peter sees someone whose power and sufficiency is greater than his own. The Christ of God is the one who is able to save God's people. And this is the disciples' response when they start to get it, when they get the lesson. This is what they see when they learn to look to Jesus for their insufficiencies. And today I'd like to offer that this ought to be our response as well. Our invitation as Christ followers is to learn to look to Jesus, who is able to do what we cannot do ourselves. Maybe today it's time for you to make that response. When we respond to the gospel, we confess that Jesus is this to us, the Christ of God. It's like what the man in Acts chapter 8 did when he said, what prevents me from being baptized? And Peter says to him, if you believe with all your heart, you may. And he says, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He's baptized right then and there. Maybe today that's the response you need to make. As we sing this song, you'll be invited to make it. Maybe for others, the response you need to make will come when we break the bread together here in just a moment. Could this be a time to remember that God was able to do what you and I could not do, and that his power is more than sufficient to make us his children? However you may be called or challenged this morning, let's follow the lead of the disciples and make our response while we stand and while we sing.